Hey guys, welcome to my channel. Today we are going to be looking at the first 8 chapters of Dracula. We're going to look at some quotes, important themes, as well as some ideas that you should keep in mind when reading the rest of the book. So, let's dive in. So before we start reading the novel, it's really important that we look at the background of this novel. So Dracula is based in England, however it uses a lot of Central European myths, specifically about the supernatural and vampires, which kind of make up the basis of the novel. It's set during Queen Victoria's reign, which, if you know much about history, was a really significant time of change. It was a lot of old ideas and new ideas all coming together to kind of make this mismatch of a society. So that's where we start our novel. We're going to start in chapter 1. So the first quote I'm going to do is quite literally the first page, the first words ever written in this book, which is May 3rd. Bistritz left Munich at 8:35 p.m. on the 1st of May, arriving at Vienna early next morning. Should have arrived at 6:46, but train was an hour late. Budapest seems a wonderful place from the glimpse from which I got of it on the train. So the book starts out with this very formal tone. We get our theme, which you can see at the top, which is writing, journaling, and messaging. And Jonathan starts writing in this journal as a travel journal. It's not personal. It was more really to recount what he sees when he explores kind of this Eastern Europe, a place where, a lot of people would travel to see the cultural differences from England. Our next quote is Jonathan recounting his kind of night, one of his first nights in this kind of getting closer and closer to Count Dracula's castle. So, I did not sleep well, though my bed was comfortable enough, for I had all sorts of queer dreams. There was a dog howling all night under my window, which may have had something to do with it, or it may have been the paprika, for I had to drink it all up, had to drink up all the water in my cafe. So we bring in two kind of motifs that we're going to explore throughout the book, and that is bloods, bats, and dogs. So obviously we have the dog howling, which we will start to learn that there is really quite a significant connection between Dracula and dogs and wolves, but also disturbed sleep and dreams. So often when people are near or around vampires, their sleep kind of starts to get a bit messed up, and they have, as Jonathan said, quite weird dreams. So our next quote is when Jonathan meets the elderly couple in which he is staying with before he takes the carriage to Dracula's castle. I faced a cheery-looking elderly woman in the usual peasant dress, white undergarment with a long double apron, front and back, of coloured stuff, fitting almost too tight for modesty. So we're introducing another theme here: romantic love, seduction, and sexual purity. And Jonathan takes one look at this woman and instantly questions her modesty based on the outfit she's wearing, despite him saying that, him noting that it's their usual peasant dress and that, it's not England. He's more close to Transylvania now. He's in the East. There's different cultures, yet he judges her on what he's wearing, and it brings in these ideas of the Victorian values, which the characters from England hold very, very highly, and it takes this kind of convincing of them to change their values. So Jonathan strikes up a conversation with the old couple he's living with, because he actually doesn't know much about Dracula, the guy he's going to supposedly work for. So he asks them. When I asked him if he knew Count Dracula and could tell me anything of his castle, both he and his wife crossed themselves, and saying that they knew nothing at all, simply refused to speak further. It is the eve of St. George's Day. Do you not know that tonight, when the clock strikes midnight, all the evil things in the world will have full sway? She then rose and dried her eyes, and taking a crucifix from her neck, offered it to me. I did not know what to do, for, as an English churchman, I have been taught to regard such things with some measure of idolatrous. Whether it is the old lady's fear, or the many ghostly traditions of this place, or the crucifix itself, I do not know, but I am not feeling nearly as easy in my mind as usual. Alright, so this is kind of 3 different sections of Jonathan's kind of start, middle, and end of conversation with the old couple, and obviously they don't want to talk about Count Dracula, and they cross themselves, which is a religious symbol, referring to our Christianity, science, and the occult. When I say Christianity, it is probably should be more like religion, science, and the occult, but We talk about St. George's Day and how they have this very strong belief that there's going to be evil things, and thus the old woman gives him this this crucifix to wear because she said, well, you're going to go out in this dangerous land. I want you to be protected. But him being English and having these different reviews doesn't really believe it. However, all that he's hearing is causing some doubt in his mind, and it's making him feel unwell. However, he is just trying to rationalize it as he still has this very grounded belief. So Jonathan's getting ready to leave, and we get this. Then a dog began to howl somewhere in a farmhouse far down the road, a long, agonizing wail, as if from fear. The sound was taken up by another dog, and then another, and another, till, borne on the wind, which now sighed softly through the pass, a wild howling began, which seemed to come from all over the country, as far as the imagination could grasp it, through the gloom of the night. So they're in the pass, which means Jonathan's left. He's in the carriage. They're on their way, and once again, this really eerie sound of a wolf howling is being described by Stoker, and bloods, bats, and dogs. You just get this kind of idea that something is not quite right, and you can almost feel Jonathan's kind of like anticipation and his kind of worry in the way he's talking, another and another, like that kind of repetition really invokes that he doesn't feel very comfortable. Alright, we're now on to chapter 2, and the first quote we're going to look at is actually the first time Jonathan properly meets Count Dracula. Welcome to my house. Enter freely and of your own free will. He made no motion of stepping to meet me, but stood like a statue, as though his gesture of welcome had fixed him into stone. The instant, however, that I stepped over the threshold, he moved impulsively forward, and holding out his hand, grasped mine with a strength which made me wince. An effort which was not lessened by the fact it seemed cold as ice, more like the hand of a dead than a living man. So Jonathan is meeting Dracula for the first time, and the first thing we get is this kind of vampirism, which over time has evolved that vampires can only come into a space if they're welcomed in, and so Dracula is welcoming Jonathan in, and that welcoming him is kind of stuck him there, like he cannot move. It has to be Jonathan that moves, and I think it's an interesting vampirism that when we look at modern vampires has really evolved over time. The most important description we get here is that very last little sentence. It seemed as cold as ice, and it's where we first get that superstition that not is all what it seems, because new theme, life, death, and the undead. Dracula's hand is really cold, and so cold in fact that Jonathan notes it, and it's something's not right, and it causes that bit of doubt right away. So as Jonathan is talking with Dracula, we get a further description of the man. His face was a very strong aquiline, with high bridge of the thin nose and peculiar arched nostrils, with lofty domed forehead and hair growing scantily round the temples, but profusely everywhere else. His eyebrows were very massive, almost meeting over the nose, and his bushy hair that seemed to curl in its own profusion. The mouth, so far that I could see it under the very heavy moustache, was fixed and rather cruel-looking, with peculiarly shaped white teeth, with which these protruded over the lips, whose remarkable ruddiness showed astonishing vitality in a man of his years. So there's actually this Victorian practice, and I'm gonna butcher the pronunciation of it, called phonology, and it's the study of looking at a human head to indicate whether or not someone is a criminal. So they believed that if you had bumps or ridges in certain parts of your head, it meant certain things, and one of them is that they thought certain people had certain bumps in places, and it would lead to them being a criminal, and it actually caused the discovery of mugshots, and that's how we got mugshots, was these people trying to categorize criminals' heads, which obviously you cannot do, but it's quite interesting how Jonathan takes such a really detailed look at this man's face and his head, not only to give, obviously Bram Stoker's doing it to give the viewer a real good image of Dracula, but also the Victorians would know phonology, and they would know what these kind of things meant and would make their own assumptions. But what we really want to look at is those cruel-looking, peculiarly sharp teeth that protruded over his lips. These are the characteristic vampire fangs that we see. You know, the first thing that Jonathan noticed are these teeth, and it really shows us that life, death, and the undead, because it's, you know, something that we equate with vampires, and it's not a normal human trait. The next description we get of Dracula is actually of his hands. But seeing them now close to me, I could not but notice that they were rather coarse, broad, with squat fingers. Strange to say, there were hairs in the centre of the palm. The nails were long and fine and cut to a sharp point. So obviously a modern day reader, unless you've got knowledge of the Victorian era and all that, and this kind of history, as well as like maybe a literary background, you probably wouldn't know why hairs in the centre of the palm is quite an interesting topic. So it was believed that if someone had hairs in the centre of their palm, they did a lot of self-pleasure. So it's actually, you know, romantic love, seduction, and sexual purity. It comes under that sexual purity that Stoker is already hinting at, this kind of connection of vampires and this lustiness and this seduction that we see later on the novel through a simple common belief that Victorians had at the time, and which Jonathan would have himself, which is probably why it was strange for him and that he thought it was worth mentioning in his journal. So Jonathan and Count Dracula having a conversation. Jonathan's asking him about all the strange things he's kind of seen and heard through his trip to the castle, and Dracula replies with this: "We are in Transylvania, and Transylvania is not England. Our ways are not your ways, and there shall be things to you, many strange things. Nay, from what you have told me of your experience already, you know something of what strange things there may be." So this whole time, Jonathan's kind of been like, "Ooh, I have these weird feelings, there's these weird things going on," but like there's obviously a rational explanation for it all. Like there's obviously no reason to be worried. And Dracula's pretty much told him, like, you're not in England anymore, you're not safe, things will be different and things will be weird. And it kind of sets up this doubt in Jonathan's mind already, and he starts to slowly believe that there are really weird things going on in this castle. As we get further through the second chapter, Jonathan starts to feel more and more worried about what's going on, and he writes, "But now I am glad I went into detail from the first, for there is something so strange about this place, and all in it, that I cannot but feel uneasy." So, again, this kind of like, he's ill, and later this illness turns to madness, and he also has gone from a kind of professional travel diary to more of a personal journal. He's really now saying what he believes and what he sees, instead of just giving the facts like a train timetable. It's definitely more personal, and the more personal that it gets, the more he's kind of slipping into that madness, and this really, I like to think, is the beginning of that. So Jonathan is a few days into his trip, and he writes this: "If there were anyone to talk to, I could bear it, but there is no one. I have only the Count to speak with, and I fear I am myself the only living soul within this place." This is just a beautiful little sentence that Stoker writes, or two sentences, because he's walked around the castle and he's realised there's no maids, there's no servants, this food appears and his room's clean, but there's no one there, and he actually like walked past his room one day and he sees that it's the Count making his bed, which is such like an odd thing to think about, but it's what makes him realise that, oh shit, I'm by myself, there's no one here. And he doesn't outright admit it, but you can kind of see where he cuts himself off, and he, talking about the Count, he can't admit that there's something he believes about the Count that is wrong because of his beliefs and whatever, but he definitely has that gut feeling. Now we have, I think, one of the most important scenes of this kind of start of the novel. This time there could be no error, for the man was close to me, and I could see him over my shoulder, but there was no reflection of him in the mirror. The whole room behind me was displayed, but there was no sign of the man in it, except myself. When the Count saw my face, his eyes blazed with a sort of demonic fury, and suddenly he grabbed at my throat. I drew away, and his hand touched the string of beads which held the crucifix. It made an instant change in him, for the fury passed so quickly that I could hardly believe that it was ever there. So Jonathan is in his room, he has a mirror set up, and he's shaving. And the Count kind of scares him, and he nicks himself, and he realizes he cannot see the Count in his mirror. And he turns to look at the Count, and the Count sees this blood, and we get that demonic fury from him. And he tries to attack Jonathan before touching the crucifix. Now, it's not really described whether or not the crucifix hurts Dracula, but it does. In the next scene, you kind of see he goes back to normal. More like he realized that he kind of knows what's going on and is protecting himself. But this is really one of the big turning points in this for Jonathan. Like, you know, if you can't see someone in a mirror, like, you can tell that he's checking and he's looking over his shoulder, and you can't see a man who's standing right next to you in the mirror, you're gonna be pretty concerned. And yeah, this scene is really important. The whole, like, this is just 2 sections of it, but I'd really read through this scene and you can take a lot of notes about it. Alright, we are ending chapter 2 with, pretty sure this is the last lines of the chapter. But I'm not in heart to describe beauty, for when I had seen the view, I explored further. Doors, doors, doors everywhere, and all locked and bolted. In no place save the windows in the castle walls is there an available exit. The castle is a veritable prison, and I am a prisoner. So Jonathan has gone into this kind of like manic panic of checking all the doors and trying to find a way out because he's just so scared and so uneasy about it all. But he's found that there's no way out. He's stuck and he's alone and he's just in this kind of like pure panic state. And this really sets up chapter 3 and chapter 4 as like just this almost full manic episode of Jonathan just not knowing what to do. But yeah, by the end of chapter 2, Jonathan is well and truly on his way to madness. Alright, on to the last chapter for today, chapter 3, and we are continuing where we left off with chapter 2. When I found out that I was a prisoner, of a sort of wild feeling came over me. I rushed up and down the stairs, trying every door and peering out of every window I could find, but after a little, the conviction of my helplessness overpowered all other feelings. When I look back after a few hours, I think I must have been mad for the time, for I behaved much as a rat does in a trap. So we're continuing on from the end of chapter 2, he's finding all the locked doors, and he literally just runs around everywhere, trying to find any secret exits, trying to, like, look, could he jump from a window, could he get away out safely, and he just feels so helpless and so stuck, and he kind of loses it, but looking back, he thinks that it's because he must have been mad at the time, and like a rat does in a trap, and that rat in the trap, kind of hints at the scientific advancements of the Victorian era, because obviously they'd know how a rat acts in a trap, because I would have studied it. They started probably implementing rat traps in their home and all and stuff like that, but he well and truly thinks that he's going insane himself. Alright, later Jonathan talks to Dracula and asks him about his history and his family, and Dracula states, "We of the Dracula blood were amongst their leaders, for our spirit would not broke, that we were not free. Ah, young sir, the Zealots and the Dracula, their heart's blood, their brain, and their sword can boast a record that mushrooms growths like the Habsburgs and the Romanovs can never reach." So Jonathan notes when Dracula's talking about his family that, like, he talks about it in a way that is almost personal, like he's lived it himself, and obviously the reader at this point has worked out that Dracula's a vampire, and he's lived so long that he probably was around for all of this, and he probably was one of the leader that was fighting against all these enemies and all these different territories. But throughout it, Dracula uses a lot of metaphors, similes, symbolism of blood and body parts and all that to represent his family tree and their power. I've kind of split up the conversation here, but it's 2 kind of things Dracula... one thing Dracula makes Jonathan do, and one thing he warns him. So he gets Jonathan to write letters to Mina, his fiancée, and his boss. It will doubtless please your friends to know that you are well. Even though he's not, Jonathan's going insane, he hates it there, he feels sick, he feels unwell. And he tells Jonathan, don't write any personal business in these letters. It is purely just to tell them you are well and you are having a great time. Then Dracula gives him a warning. Let me warn you, with all seriousness, that should you leave these rooms, you will not by go chance sleep in any part of the castle. So he pretty much says, if you sleep in any part of the castle, bad things are going to happen. Do not sleep. And it kind of sets up this irony for a bit later, in one of the coming up, like literally the next couple quotes, a really important scene that we're going to talk about. But yeah, Dracula says, do not sleep in any other room other than your bed. That is where you're safe. So Jonathan is exploring the castle. It's a bit later at night, and he writes this in his journal. I saw the whole man slowly emerge from the window and begin to crawl down the castle wall over the dreadful abyss, face down, with his cloak spreading around him like great wings. So obviously it's Dracula. Jonathan's trying to rationalize it. Like, I think originally he thinks it's maybe a trick of the light, but then he realizes, no, this man is climbing down the castle wall, and his cloak spreading around the great wings. It kind of like gives that vampirism of vampires and bats, which we see later on. A bat is tied again to Dracula. But yeah, it's just the start of the little bit of an end for Jonathan here when he sees Dracula climbing out that window. So the next scene we're going to be talking about is the three vampire women, and I've kind of taken bits and pieces out of the scenes which I want to talk about because I think are most interesting, but really go through the whole scene. There's like so much to pick apart, and I really had to try and condense it to get the ideas across to you. So, in the moonlight opposite me were three young women, ladies by their dress and manner. I thought at the time that I must be dreaming when I saw them. They threw no shadow on the floor. They came close to me and looked at me for some time and then whispered together. Two were dark and had high aquiline noses like the Count, and great dark piercing eyes that seemed to be almost red when contrasted with the yellow pale moon. So we get this description of the vampire ladies, and we kind of know they're vampires because they're compared to the Count. They look the same. There's that red kind of colour motif as well. And we also can know they're vampires because Jonathan felt like he was dreaming when he saw them. So sleep, disturbed sleep, and dreaming all really come into the vampires. You know when they're around because someone struggles to sleep or has really vivid dreams. Alright, we're continuing with the three vampire women scene. All three had brilliant white teeth that shone like pearls against the ruby of their voluptuous lips. There was something about them that made me uneasy, some longing, and at the same time some deadly fear. I felt in my heart a wicked, burning desire that they would kiss me with those red lips. It is not good to note this down, lest some day it should meet Mina's eyes, cause her pain, but it is the truth. So, this first kind of deadly interaction with vampires, Stoker connects the ideas of this kind of lust, deadly lust, with the vampires, because Jonathan wants them to kiss him and to inevitably bite him. He doesn't realize that that's what's going to happen, but it's because the vampires seem to manipulate people to really want it and to bring out that Victorian repressed sexual desire. I'm using in loose quotation marks here. You'll see that voluptuousness, and that words like that is used so often when describing vampire women. It kind of becomes like a bit of a bingo sheet, like how many times can you spell voluptuous when describing a woman in this novel. But again, you can use it when you write essays, if you're doing this for school, to tie together all these scenes by one word. It's pretty fun to try and find them all, but yeah, the voluptuous has this sexual connotation to it, so you can kind of picture those ruby red lips. And he knows it's wrong because as he's noting it down, he literally mentions his fiancée Mina. He knows it's wrong, yet there's this unwavering desire. Alright, we're still with the vampire woman. They whispered together, and then they, all three, laughed, such a silvery, musical laugh, but as hard as though the sound never could have come through the softness of human lips. It was like the intolerable tingling sweetness of water glasses when played on by a cunning hand. So I've underlined a silvery musical laugh because I believe later in the novel, Music is used again to describe a vampire woman. I feel like it's Lucy. I feel like later Lucy, I'm gonna have to fact check that, but I'm pretty sure later that silvery musical laugh comes back. But it's not human, is the first thing Jonathan notes. That it's beautiful and it's intolerably sweet, but it is not human, and that is the allure of these vampires. That there is something so fantastically non-human about them, but at the same time, that non-human element is just really a turn off as well at the same time. So it's kind of this balancing act. They lure people in, but then when people realize what they are, they're repulsed. Alright, same scene, new quote. We've kind of continued forward. Jonathan's just lying there, a bit submissively, letting it happen. So, I was afraid to raise my eyelids, but looked out and saw perfectly under the lashes. The girl went on her knees and bent over me, simply gloating. There was a deliberate voluptuousness which was both thrilling and repulsive, and as she arched her neck, she actually licked her lips like an animal, till I could see in the moonlight the moisture shining on the scarlet lips and on the red tongue as it lapped the white, sharp teeth. So, obviously Stoker is just really hinting at an extremely sexual act here. You know, she's on her knees, she's bent over him. We're going to see later that it's not. She's really just going to bite him, but Jonathan mentions, as I mentioned with the quote before, thrilling and repulsive. He's lured into them, but at the same time, he knows they're not human and it repulses him, which I think is a really interesting contrast when we look at how Vampire Lucy is treated later on in the novel. Then she paused, and I could hear the churning sound of her tongue as it licked her teeth and lips, and I could feel the hot breath on my neck. Then the skin of my throat began to tingle, as one's flesh does when the hand that is to tickle it approaches nearer. I could feel the soft, shivering touch of the lips on the super-sensitive skin of my throat, and the hard dents of two sharp teeth, just touching and pausing there. I closed my eyes in languorous ecstasy and waited with beating heart. So, the vampire woman's about to, he thinks, kiss, but really she's going to bite him and suck his blood out. And it is again this ecstasy and a beating heart and this just, what would you call it? This, like, sensation. Guess you could call it, like, the final ends of a sexual act, like, you know, you're getting close to finishing, but it's not really. We see that later on, that probably the end of a vampire act is more like that than, like, the start, but it's that anticipation, that's the word I was looking for, anticipation of what's going to happen that really draws Jonathan in. So, finally, Dracula actually comes into the room and finds Jonathan and the ladies. On this, the other woman joined, and such a mirthless, hard, soulless laughter rang through the room that it almost made me faint to hear. It seemed like the pleasures of fines, and then the Count turned, after looking at my face attentively, and said in a soft whisper, "Yes, I too can love. You yourselves can tell it from the past. Is it not so? Well, now I promise that when I am done with him, you shall kiss him at your will. Now go. Go. I must awaken him, for there is work to be done." So, throughout the novel, like, some classic novels have it more, but there is going to be these kind of hints at homosexuality, but it's not probably really that. It's just Bram Stoker implying the sexual nature of the vampires. But there are plenty of articles in which you can read which explore the homosexuality in this, but also that Dracula has a purpose for Jonathan and thus is protecting him until that purpose is done. Our final quote for today is the last lines of chapter 3. Then the horror overcame me, and I sank down, unconscious. So after his little escapade, I guess you could say, don't know if that's the right word, with the 3 vampire ladies, Dracula coming, stopping it, and kind of looking after Jonathan, he just is out like a light, and when we see him next, he's actually waking up after it, in kind of a bit of disbelief. But again, it's that tie that the vampires can kind of induce sleep. It's almost implied Dracula puts him to sleep, but it also could be that he's Jonathan is so stressed and has gone through so much that he just passes out. Alright, we're going to do a quick overview and analysis of some things. First up is our Victorian values. I think it's really important to do a little bit of research on the Victorian time when reading this novel, because there's a lot of things that you're not going to be able to understand. So, Jonathan views the old couple as superstitious, and his religious views that comes into that, as well as their promiscuity of the woman, even though she's described as an older lady. And the activities at Castle Dracula, how you can kind of see this rationalization of what's going on before he truly realizes what's going on. And we also start to explore women's sexuality in these first chapters and how Stoker is presenting it as a negative thing. Whether or not that is his beliefs doesn't matter, but at this moment he is presenting that the vampire women are innately sexual and thus is bad. One kind of topic of this book that I think is really important to look at now is the idea of the new woman. I think it's good to get an understanding now when we first meet the vampire women, so that when we meet Mina and Lucy and their dynamic, you've got an understanding already of what we're trying to look out for. So the new woman was a feminist movement in the late 19th and early 20th century. This was mainly a European, North American thing, and it was changing the ideals of what a woman was in society and how she was meant to act, and her kind of independence and dependence on a man. So the new woman pursued education and careers, which were often, well, most fields were dominated by men, so in male-dominated fields. They advocated for their rights to vote and just human rights. They were really associated with the feminist ideals of the equality between sexes, which is ideals that are still carried on today, so it's very relevant. And the most important thing is that they had sexual freedom, like we see with the vampire women. So the new woman was seen, true or not, as this extremely promiscuous, negatively, by those kind of rigid Victorian patriarchal structures, because they wanted a role in their sexuality and their love and their relationships, instead of just passively being passed from man to man. The opposite of this was called the angel of the house, or the stereotypical Victorian woman. So they were the primary caregivers and they looked after the home, and they mainly stayed at home. They had moral virtue and innocence and were considered, you know, the again, the angel of the house, but the head of the, not the head of the household, but the one who looked after the house. They were expected to be obedient to their fathers and husbands. So when, as a child and growing up, they belonged to their father. Once they were married, they belonged to their husbands. And these women had complete economic dependence on these men, because they had no way of earning money, and so relied solely on their husbands or fathers for that financial support. Alrighty, thanks for watching. That's the first 3 chapters. There's a little analysis and overview of Dracula. My plan is to do the rest of the chapters, as well as I've got a couple of other books and poetry that I want to do some kind of like insight and analysis on. Of course, if there's any books you want to recommend that you want me to look at, or maybe some themes within this chapter that you want me to explore more, happy to make a little follow-up video. So yeah, thanks for watching.